Another day, another injury. Let's discuss on Fantasy Baseball Today Express. Welcome into FBT Express on Tuesday, February 25th. I am Frank Stampfl, joined by Chris Towers, and the latest injury, once again, to the Mets rotation. Sean Manaea has an oblique injury and will start the season on the IL. He'll be shut down for a couple of weeks before being reevaluated. His ADP before this injury was 169 as the SP 52 off the board. Chris, how much did you lower Sean Manaea in your rankings?
Well, I feel a little bad that I'm the one on the podcast because Scott White's the one whose heart is broken by this news. Actually, he's not. He's mostly unconcerned because, look, the timetable for this injury, whether you go by what's been reported or the average for pitchers coming back from oblique strains, puts him around the second week of April coming back. Like that's about what you would expect for this injury. So if that's all that happens, he misses 2 or 3 starts, that doesn't really change a player's value all that much. So you could argue that Sean Manaea really shouldn't be moved down very much at all. I would make the opposite argument, though. I moved him down to 290th in my Roto rankings. That's around 80th overall at starting pitcher. So someone who should be drafted in every 12-team Roto league, but probably someone who should be drafted as more of a bench stash now, because if Sean Manaea comes back and is healthy 2 weeks into the season, maybe you have nothing to be concerned about, but that's not necessarily how it works. Oblique injuries are tricky. They can tend to linger, and not just when a player is, recovering from them, but when a player is healthy, because I'll look back to the 2 high profile pitchers who had oblique injuries last spring, Yohan Duran and Paul Sewald, who were both closers at the time. Paul Sewald ended up not remaining a closer, but they both saw their ERA rise from 2023 to 2024 by about 1.2 runs. Both lost about between a half and 1 mile per hour on their velocity from 2023 to 2024. And both were just generally less effective. Now, how much of that is, Sewald was maybe already declining. He's in his mid-30s. Well, Manaea is a little older too. So I don't know if that gets him out of the woods either. And obviously, I think doing this as a starting pitcher probably makes it a little trickier than doing it as a reliever. So I hope Sean Manaea comes back and has no ill effects from this, but I don't think you can necessarily assume that will be the case, especially because we're only talking about an 11-start stretch last season or 12-start stretch where Sean Manaea looked like a true difference maker in fantasy. He had a 3.09 ERA, 28.4% strikeout rate, coincided with lowering his arm slot, looked sustainable. But here's the thing. We don't know if it was sustainable. It's throwing from a lower arm slot might not be sustainable in terms of the control. It might put extra stress on his shoulder or elbow. It might also just be that he looked a lot better because hitters weren't used to him throwing that way. And with an off season of video and, guys set up that traject machine and get a better look at what Sean Manaea is doing, maybe he's just not as effective as he was last season. So I already had my questions about Manaea before this injury, and I don't feel better about it, certainly, now that he's going to miss the entire spring likely.
All right, let's take a quick break. When we return, we'll talk about the Mets' updated rotation. We'll do that right after this.
The clock never stops. Relive the greatest moments with uninterrupted highlights and more.
It's Gareth Bale! Go! Wonderful goal!
On the UEFA Champions League channel. Streaming free.
Welcome back in FBT Express. So, Sean Manaea likely to start the season on the IL. The Mets wanted a 6-man rotation entering spring training. With Manaea and Frankie Montas hurt, doesn't look like that's going to happen. The updated rotation, Kodai Senga, David Peterson, Clay Holmes, Paul Blackburn, and Griffin Canning. Not the best rotation we've ever seen.
This is a team that has a lot of expectations and is going to cost a lot of money. And they are not a lock for the playoffs. Like, even if Montas and Manaea are back, that's a decent rotation, but maybe not a great one. Senga obviously missed almost the entirety of last season. Peterson has been very up or down in his career. The rest of those guys are just kind of rotation fillers for the most part. So
Lee Holmes, we have no idea.
Yeah, I mean,
starting, like
I'm optimistic after that spring debut where he showed off a changeup and a cutter, but yeah, the Mets are not at all a sure thing to make the playoffs, I would say.
Yeah. Chris, do you think there's any chance if one of their top pitching prospects, Brandon Sproat, has a big spring that we could see him in their rotation on opening day?
There's a chance. Yeah. He was one of the fastest risers on prospect lists last season, dominated high A, dominated double A. The problem is he got to AAA, made 7 starts there, and was not quite as effective. In fact, he had an ERA over 7 in those 7 starts. So I would guess the Mets would prefer that Brandon Sproat go back to AAA, prove it there. And look, he may be up before Sean Manaea, if that's the case. If he looks good this spring, starts a couple times in AAA and looks like he's ready, that might be all it takes. But I would be at this point a little surprised if Brandon Sproat cracked the opening day roster.
We keep hearing the name Dylan Cease, Michael King. The Padres are shopping these guys. The Mets have Juan Soto, Francisco Lindor in the middle of their primes. It kind of feels like this would be a pretty good fit for one of those pitchers. So we'll see how aggressive the Mets are the rest of this offseason. A couple of their Statcast items from Monday spring training action. Chris, we had Cole Reagan's fastball velocity was up 1.5 miles per hour. I think that's a really good sign after his velocity was down the last month of last season. And then Zach Gallen, the other end of the spectrum, his velocity was way down. Fastball and changeup down 3 miles per hour. His curve was down 2 miles per hour. It's just one start, really small sample size, 1 or 2 innings for these guys. Either of these things matter to you so far?
Not really, mostly because Reagan's was awesome. Even when his velocity was diminished late in the season, he still remained clearly a must-start pitcher, an ace, and I think he can still be effective, whether it's sitting, 94.5 or sitting 96. Obviously, I'd rather him sit 96, and it's a good sign. But look, anytime we're talking about the first spring outing especially, it's really hard to know, was this guy's velocity up because his velocity is up forever? Or was this guy's velocity up because he knew he only had to throw 30 pitches and he just decided to air it out? That's impossible for us to say. And on the opposite side, and what I suspect was going on with Gallen, because there was some, his arm angle and his release point were up a little bit in this start as well. So to me, is Gallen's velocity down because he just can't throw hard anymore? Or was his velocity down because he's working on some mechanical adjustments in spring, wanted to see what it looks like? He didn't really care about the results. That's always the thing. Like Max Scherzer famously at his best would always have terrible spring trainings. Zach Greinke would come out in spring training throwing about 76 miles per hour every year, and we'd freak out. And it's just, when you're talking about established guys, I don't really care, especially in the first spring outing. So I'll Tristan McKenzie's velocity was up. I think it would have been the 3rd or 4th highest it had ever been for a start at the major league level. That tells me something, because that can tell me, well, let's put Tristan McKenzie on my late round radar. I'm not going to drop Zach Gallen or move Cole Reagan's up because of one spring start. They're too high to be changing their rankings based on this.
All right. For more extensive fantasy baseball coverage, listen to our full-length podcast, Fantasy Baseball Today, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Thanks for listening to Fantasy Baseball Today Express, and we will be back again tomorrow. Bye-bye.